Welcome, everybody. It's so great to have you all here. My name is Jody Chang, and my husband and Curtis and I live in San Jose in the Bay Area. So this topic is of particular personal interest to us, and we're so happy that you're all here to learn alongside. Several years ago, when Curtis and I were becoming personally more and more concerned about climate change and wanting to deploy more of our personal resources in the effort, I approached a trusted friend who is a longtime funder in environment and climate change causes, and just asked for his recommendations of effective nonprofits working in this area. And Rocky Mountain Institute was at the very top of his list. And that's how Curtis and I became supporters, and why we're here today, and why we're thrilled that you're all here with us. So I'll share the agenda. So you all can see we have some fantastic speakers and topics. I'll just let you take a minute to read this so that you see what we're doing today with Jules, Rushad, and Mark. And just a quick note on Q&A, we're in the interest of time asking folks to put comments and questions into the chat function during the entire meeting, and then we'll have Q&A together at the end. I'd love to introduce Jules for you all. So Jules Kortenhorst is the Chief Executive Officer of Rocky Mountain Institute. He's a recognized leader on global energy issues and climate change, and his background spans business, government, entrepreneurial, and nonprofit leadership. Prior to RMI, Jules was the founding CEO of the European Climate Foundation. And before launching ECF, he served as a member of the Dutch Parliament for the Christian Democratic Party. During the first 20 years of his career, Jules was the CEO for international operations of Client Logic Corporation. He worked for almost 10 years for Royal Dutch Shell and began his career as an analyst at McKinsey. Jules currently serves on the Energy Transition Commission, and he is the co-chair of the WEF Future Council on Energy. He also is a non-executive board member of the Energy Web Foundation and of Solidia Technologies, and an advisory board member of Land Life Company. And we're so thrilled to get to hear from Jules today.
Thank you for those kind words, Jody, and delighted to see all of you on this third installment of our webinar series focused on California. Some of you will have heard my spiel before because we've used this to kick off each of these webinars, but I hope you'll bear with me. The story hasn't changed. When it comes to climate change, winning slowly is the same as losing. We have to double down our efforts, not just to get to a world that is net zero by the middle of the century in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but to really drive a 50% reduction in emissions already over the next 10 years, the decisive decade. Next slide. And that is illustrated in this graph. The problem of climate change is one of cumulative emissions over time. It is the bathtub of the atmosphere that is full of greenhouse gas emissions. So it really makes a difference if we do this along the dashed line curve, sort of very slowly first and then accelerating by the middle of the century, or if we actually drive in line with a 1.5 degree objective, an immediate reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 50% over the next decade. That is the goal that we've committed ourselves to at RMI. That's also the recommendation of the scientists, once again reinforced by the IPCC report of 2 weeks ago. Next slide. So that means that everything we have to do has to start scaling at a very rapid pace, at the pace of an S-curve. And of course, we have seen that very often in technology areas such as mobile telephony or the internet or e-commerce, but it is less common in the energy system. We're going to need to bring all the levers of change to bear: policy, technology, the impact of measuring what we want to achieve, data and transparency, finance, business models, as well as education and capacity building, particularly for key decision makers in the energy system in developing countries and emerging economies. So that's why our program emerges as follows. Next slide. At RMI, we are focused on doing two things in 5 places. First, we drive the decarbonization of the critical sectors of the energy economy. Second, we strengthen those market catalysts that we think has the greatest chance of accelerating the transition. And third, we do that across critical geographies around the world, as well as in cities. In the sectors, the cornerstone of our clean energy system of the future is going to be carbon-free power, carbon-free electricity, that then becomes the engine for carbon-free mobility, our electric vehicles, and buildings that don't burn carbon, and carbon-free buildings and energy-efficient buildings has been the theme of an earlier webinar. And finally, we need to decarbonize industries to drive the shift away from polluting sectors like steel and cement and the new technologies that need to be deployed in that area. All of that will happen faster if we indeed measure the data and create a transparency that allow us to monitor the progress in each of these sectors. If we bring to bear the power of international finance by shifting the allocation of capital from high carbon to low carbon assets. If we collaborate to reduce, to strengthen the capacity of decision making on the energy transition, particularly in developing countries. And finally, if we help kickstart the technologies that are going to drive the changes, those technologies that we don't have like wind and solar, but particularly those technologies that we need like clean steel or green cement or hydrogen or long duration storage. And finally, we need to do that all around the world. But RMI is focused first and foremost on 3 critical geographies, the US, China, and India, that together represent such a large part of global emissions. We work selectively in developing countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and small island states. And finally, we've picked cities as a place where the decision-making on climate change, as well as the impacts, come together, and where the work that we do can have a real impact. So let me introduce now our next speaker. And it happens to be Rushad Nanavatty, who is our Managing Director for Urban Transformation. Rushad joined us several years ago, and over the course of the last years at RMI has helped lead the Global Cooling Prize, has driven the emergence of the Energy Web Foundation, our partnership between RMI and Grid Singularity that leverages blockchain in the energy sector. But over the last 2 years, he has focused on our work in cities, where we partner with, among others, Bloomberg Philanthropies, to give city leaders the tools to make the right decisions on climate change. Before coming to RMI, Rushad worked at McKinsey & Company, focused on sustainability, infrastructure, and economic development. But he also was the COO of WeGen Energy, a startup developing off-grid energy solutions and virtual power plants in Southeast Asia. Rushad, over to you.
Thank you, Jules. Can we go to the next page? Great. So I'm going to be talking about a critical resilience and mitigation issue, urban heat and sustainable urban cooling. Next page. So I think many of us have read or at least come across the latest IPCC assessment report, and the headlines are, as disturbing as they've ever been. One thing it makes plainer than ever is that global warming isn't really one crisis. It's a multitude of crises: drought, sea level rise and flooding, economic harm. Next page. One of those crises is the warming itself. July 2021, last month, was the hottest month ever recorded on our planet in 142 years of record keeping. It could also very conceivably be one of the coolest Julys for the rest of our lives. And you all have obviously felt this acutely in California. This graphic is showing the anticipated frequency of heat wave events in the Bay Area and Central Valley over the coming decades. So Oakland and San Jose experience 1, maybe 2 of these extreme heat waves a year right now. That could grow to 5, 6, 8 by the end of the century. And in the darkest areas, you're looking at 20 or more. Next page. That risk gets massively compounded when the grid fails at the same time. And the grid, unfortunately, does tend to fail at the same time. Nearly half of the blackout events that we see in the US occur in June, July, August. Cities are simply not prepared for this. If we see these kind of overlapping events in as an example, Atlanta, Detroit, Phoenix, between 70 and 100% of their populations could be exposed to dangerous, for some people, even deadly indoor air temperatures. That's one reason, just one reason grid resilience is so important, which Mark and David are going to be talking about next. Next page. Of course, as ever, it's lower income groups who hurt the most. So the brown on this map represents lower income households in the Bay Area. Next page. And you see almost perfect overlap with the areas that are most vulnerable to heat-related health impacts. Next page. I'm going to zoom out of California for a bit now. Some of you will have read or at least come across this book. Ezra Klein and Barack Obama both called it the most important book of the year. The opening chapter features a heat wave in northern India that kills 20 million people. And what makes that scene so devastating is that it's completely, utterly plausible, not just in some distant future, but today. Next page. By 2050, we could have major portions of northern India and Pakistan, some of the most densely populated parts of the world, routinely experiencing heat waves that cross the survivability threshold, conditions under which a person basically can't stay alive outside beyond a few hours. An 80% chance of one of these events happening at least once a decade. And there's no escaping this. India's outdoor labor force is about 400 million people: farmers, construction workers, laborers, street vendors. Next page. Our adaptive response to heat is air conditioning. Unfortunately, that adaptive response is incredibly destructive to the climate. Only 9% of Indian households have an air conditioner today. Next page. But that is changing very, very, very fast. Under a business as usual scenario, we're going to need more than 5,000 terawatt hours of additional electricity each year to operate just our room air conditioners. For perspective, that's the same as the annual electricity consumption of the US, Japan, and Germany combined. Next page. Air conditioning load is especially problematic for the grid because it drives peak demand. Demand that is the most difficult, most expensive, often the most polluting to serve. Next page. The ultimate climate impact of all of this is that room air conditioners alone could eat up half the world's remaining carbon budget. Or to put it differently, air conditioning could be the proximate cause of 1/4 degree Celsius of global warming impact. Next page. If we're going to bend down that curve on the last page, we need to address the problem at multiple different scales: at the scale of the household, at the scale of the building, at the scale of the street or city block, and at the scale of the city or metropolitan region. Next page. First, the scale of the household. So we launched an initiative called the Global Cooling Prize in 2018. It was a technology competition aimed at developing an air conditioner with 5 times or 80% less climate impact than the standard units on the market. A lot of people thought this was crazy. 2x maybe, 3x maybe, but 5x no way. Companies would be too intimidated by the criteria to even apply. We ended up having over 2,000 teams register, 139 submitting detailed technical applications. 8 finalists made it through to actual prototype development. Most importantly, not 1, but 2 teams exceeded our criteria. And now we're focused on getting these solutions to the market quickly and at scale, securing commitments for manufacturing and procurement, helping governments update policies, revising testing standards, etc. Next page. In more temperate places like the Bay Area or San Francisco, the solution is not an AC, it's a heat pump. If you use the same electric appliance to both cool and warm your home, that's the column on the right, it's going to cost you less than a separate AC and a gas-fired furnace. And of course, by getting rid of that gas-fired furnace, you're also substantially reducing your household emissions. Next, the building scale. One way we reduce cooling demand is by making our buildings more thermally efficient. 70% of our buildings will be standing in 2050 in this country. So our biggest challenge is around retrofits. Right now, we're only retrofitting about 1% of our buildings each year. We need to be doing close to 5%. Our Realize initiative, which is featured on this page, involves trying to streamline and standardize a process that's typically really, really bespoke, time-consuming, expensive, not very reliable. Next page. It is, of course, a hell of a lot easier to build right from the start than it is to retrofit. So to that end, we've just launched a Codes for Climate initiative in partnership with the New Buildings Institute. 60% of buildings emissions in the US come from 10 states that have authority over buildings policy. And we're in the process of helping those 10 states update their codes to be completely aligned with our climate goals. In a global South context, with multiple buildings, the most efficient way to meet cooling demands is often through district cooling systems. The biggest source of efficiency is that the system, in this case, is sized for the highest aggregate cooling load, as opposed to the sum of the individual building loads. These systems have the lowest life cycle costs, but they need massive, massive upfront investment. So best suited for major new developments or redevelopments. And there is, of course, a ton of new district scale urban development happening in places like India and Indonesia, which is why we're focused on those places on this topic. At the level of this, next page. At the one more, sorry. At the level of the street or the city block, there's huge potential for better urban design to reduce cooling loads. 40% of anthropogenic heat in cities comes from cars, so transportation interventions are key. Cool surfaces, surfaces that reflect and shed heat for roofs, walls, road surfaces, making more use of trees and green space in the urban environment. Even the placement and relative height of buildings matters to optimize between airflow, sky view, shade. Next. And finally, major citywide planning exercises, things like master plans, infrastructure plans, comprehensive plans, need to start factoring in heat resilience in a much, much more meaningful way. One example is that cities can take advantage of blue and green spaces to create cool corridors. The evaporative cooling from parks, water bodies, creates basically convection currents. And if you create corridors of vegetation and water parallel to prevailing winds, you essentially draw ventilation through a city, almost like a gigantic biological desert cooler. And that's what you see in these images from Thanwa in Vietnam and Barcelona in Spain. And finally, next page. Our hope and plan at RMI is to bring all of these best practices together in India, which is ground zero for this challenge. Right now, we're in the process of wrapping up work on an urban cooling handbook, which we hope can serve as a comprehensive guide to these efforts. Next, in partnership with the UN Environment Programme, we're going to quickly move from the think to what we describe as the do and the scale. The do is about two things. One, building critical public sector capacity, starting with India's Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. And two, creating a model of success through deep engagement in one major city. The scale is about using a cohort-based approach to deliver technical assistance on this topic to 100 of India's largest cities. In carbon terms, we're talking about the potential to avoid 250 million tons worth of emissions, which is roughly equivalent to 10% of India's total. And that's it from me. If any of you, of course, would like to talk further about any of this, please just let us know. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Ezekiel.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Curtis Chang. I'm also your co-host, and I wanted to say a quick word about why Jody and I are indeed hosts and supporters of RMI. I'm a nonprofit consultant and know a little bit about a lot of issues. But one thing I do know is when organizations are critical to a particular cause. I really think RMI fits that bill because I think RMI provides a most critical renewable resource in this issue, which is a resource that we don't talk a lot about, but which is frankly hope. I find in myself a temptation to look at the challenges that seem so insurmountable and just want to go hide and go not think about this anymore. And it's primarily because I lose hope. And so one of the things I love about RMI is that they don't shy away from the facts. They clearly know their stuff, but they still retain this optimism and hope that things can be done. And I'm not smart enough or knowledgeable enough to know whether they can pull this off or not, but I do recognize hope, a hopeful spirit when I see it. And I think it's so important that we back people and organizations that exude that, because that's the critical renewable resource that we absolutely need if we're going to make progress on this. And it's what I appreciate about them. And I also appreciate that I learned so much from them as well. So that they're not just giving me hope, but they're giving me knowledge as well. And one example of knowledge that they give me is just about the issue of power and power, the grid and grid resilience, some of the issues that we just learned about here. And so we wanted to actually give you a poll to help sort of lead us into the next bit of learning. And this poll is, which of the following is not a top cause of outages in a region of the US? So the choices are extreme weather, equipment problems, squirrels, and cyber attacks. So we'll give you some time. It's just a one question poll. So go ahead and fill that out. And while you're filling that out, I wanted to actually introduce our next speaker, which is Mark Dyson. Mark is a principal with the carbon-free electricity practice at RMI, where he's worked since 2008. And he currently leads RMI's research and collaboration efforts around the roles that distributed energy resources can play in grid planning investment. And at RMI, Mark has led cutting-edge research projects on the value that renewable energy, demand flexibility, and storage offers customers in the grid. And he's advised clients, including large utilities, regulatory commissions, oil majors, clean tech companies on distributed energy topics. Prior to joining RMI, Mark worked at Ascend Analytics, helping deploy software for grid dispatch optimization and financial modeling to several large energy companies. Mark's also held research positions at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, working on improving regional electricity system planning models, and also at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, working on analysis of potential for aggregated demand response programs to provide ancillary services. So that's a mouthful, and I'm really glad Mark's here to explain all of that for us.
Thank you, Curtis. And thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here today. Looking at the poll results, it looks like folks have the right answer. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, the right answer is cyber attacks. And I'll touch on that during my remarks today. But while there's a lot of news about the risk of cyber attacks on the grid, in fact, squirrels are the leading cause of outages in this country and have been for a while. Squirrels and trees and other mundane things like that, and should be accounted for and are being planned for. But my remarks today are about a set of threats that are much bigger than our animal friends. So I'd like to talk about how we at RMI think about building and supporting utilities and policymakers in building resilient grids for California and also beyond, because a lot of our work is, of course, global, as Jules mentioned. So if we can go to the next slide, I think it's worth, as a preamble here, to reflect on the nature of the grid that we all rely on for our livelihoods. It arose in the 20th century as a one-way street of value and services, from fuel delivered to power plants to generation facilities that convert that fuel into electric power, to high voltage, long distance transmission lines that ship that across the country, to local distribution lines, which you all see every day around your homes, and then finally to things within our houses and businesses that we use. And this kind of one-way street of value and services made sense given the technologies available in the 1950s and surrounding decades. But it might not make sense anymore given the shifting technology landscape. Unfortunately, we're stuck with the architecture for the foreseeable in this several trillion-dollar machine that we have called the US grid. So if we can go to the next slide, a downside of that architecture is that, one more previous, please. A downside of that architecture is that any one of an emerging set of threats can disable large swaths of that one-way value chain for weeks or months. These 4 threats that I'll characterize here are all much scarier than squirrels. Extreme weather and natural disasters, of course, you are all living this, as are we in Colorado and Texas and everywhere else. Physical attacks have happened on the US grid and taken out portions of the grid before. There was a memorable example in the peninsula in the Bay Area a few years back, but most of those have been near misses, and we have yet to see any large scale outages as a result of physical attacks, but the risk is there. Cyber attacks, as I've already mentioned, a growing threat. No major outages yet in the United States due to cyber attacks, but we've seen them in other countries, and we know that utilities are getting attacked every day, both from in-country actors as well as state-sponsored organizations. And then finally, electromagnetic pulses and geomagnetic disturbances. Basically, detonating a nuclear bomb at high altitude has the same effect as a natural solar storm and could take down huge swaths of the transmission system in this country for weeks or months at a time. So all of these threats are uniquely risky because of this one-way street that we have on the US power system. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I probably don't need to tell you about a lot of this because it's already in the news, both in your backyards as well as around the country. So of course, the news from last year around the blackout, of course, in August of 2020, flex alerts being issued regarding heat coupled with wildfires disrupting power lines. This is part and parcel of the California story today. It's not just California, it's Texas. You all, I'm sure, read the news of that horrible, horrible outage, but an underreported story was that it could have been much worse and lasted months. It could have been a statewide blackout for a month or longer if the grid operators in Texas did not take decisive action to shed load when they did. And then it's even happening in places like New York City, where due to a kind of a set of events, somewhat uncorrelated, Con Edison and the city had to send out text messages urging residents to reduce consumption in an emergency basis. So of course, again, this is all in the news. If we can go to the next slide, I want to just anchor you a bit in how we've thought about this problem and then how we've applied it in California and elsewhere. So a couple years ago, we set out to understand how we can address some of these existential threats for the grid, even as we proceed in our mission to accelerate grid decarbonization in California, in US, and globally. To do that, we set up a study that had 4 outage scenarios that correspond to plausible and credible threats that we see increasing in magnitude today. So fuel disruption, what we saw in Texas with gas pipelines and coal piles freezing at power plants. Generation outages, so again, what we saw in Texas and what we've seen in California of actual system failures at power plants relating to extreme weather, both hot and cold. Transmission system outages, of course, you're living this in California right now with the threats to high voltage wires from Northern California and Oregon wildfires. And then in distribution, we see this, of course, with hurricanes in the Southeast United States, in Texas, in the Caribbean, which my colleague David will talk about, where large swaths of poles and wires at a local level can be disabled by a single event. So we looked at those 4 big picture threats to the grid, and then we looked at 3 different scenarios in which they could show up. What if one of these things happened in a grid like California today, which is something like 40% renewable? What if this happened in a grid that is much more highly renewable, 70%, say? And what happens if these events would take place in a grid that is almost completely decarbonized and also relies heavily on local resources like rooftop solar or community scale solar backed up by storage? So if we go to the next slide, I'll spare you the details of the findings, but I would like to highlight 4 principles for grid resilience that came out of this work and I think are worth sitting with for a minute. The first is that we need to start addressing and not ignoring the threat that is driven by this one-way value chain, this linear dependence that we have in the US grid today and in grids globally. In short, system planners often just seek to shore up individual pieces of that one-way value chain instead of breaking the chain, turning it into a mesh. And we've identified opportunities to do that with our partners in California and beyond. The second principle is that we need to leverage the market and stop fighting it when it comes to investing in resilience. You know, we saw during the Trump administration an effort to subsidize economically failing coal plants in the name of resilience and reliability, which is, you know, frankly, putting good money after bad. And instead, there's an opportunity to capitalize on the investments that investors and utilities are already making in renewables and build a more resilient system using things that the market is already prioritizing. The third principle is that we have an opportunity to better prioritize critical loads. Given the threats we're facing in this country and globally to our grids, it's unlikely that we will ever actually avoid all the big outages that might come our way, but we can and should keep the lights on for critical facilities like hospitals. We can and should keep the electricity flowing to critical devices like in-home medical care devices, without which there would be loss of life and suffering. And there are other examples of those critical loads too. The current approach to resilience is kind of an all or nothing deal in many cases. And then finally, we have an opportunity to maximize the economic value out of resilience investments. You know, a backup generator is like insurance in that you pay for it and you pray that you never have to use it. Whereas other examples, other emerging solutions actually pay back by providing value every day. And I'll give you an example of that for California here in a minute. So if we can move to the next slide, I would like to bring this into the California context and just share some thoughts about what this looks like and how some of the work we're doing really fits in your state. So to start, I'd like to talk through these 4 kind of emerging solutions. So if you can click here, yeah, I'll talk through 4 different approaches that epitomize these principles that I just walked through. The first is targeted energy efficiency. So this is imagining targeting energy efficiency investments in the facilities or loads that really need to stay online during an outage, or on the other hand, could help prevent an outage. And the example here from the Energy Institute at Berkeley is of investing in air conditioner efficiency or building insulation that reduces air conditioner energy needs during heat waves, which can help avoid blackouts in the first place and also provide more hours of safety during a blackout for the residences and lead to lower health impacts. The second is demand flexibility. Some of you might be familiar with a campaign that a company called Ohm Connect is running in California right now, where they're seeking to give out 1 million free thermostats that they would then enroll in these demand response or demand flexibility programs, essentially shifting your set point a few degrees, making your house a couple degrees warmer in the name of keeping the lights on for all Californians. The third example is of advanced inverters coupled with resilient connections and transfer switches that let solar plus storage systems actually island either at the home level or at the community level and provide power to critical loads during a broader outage. I'll talk through an example of what this looks like with numbers in a minute. And then the final thought here is autonomous energy grids. One of our utility partners in Colorado calls this concept the self-driving grid, like we sometimes think about self-driving cars, where humans are out of the loop in responding to outages that can take down wide swaths of the transmission system, but leave distribution systems intact and able to provide power to critical loads at the neighborhood level. And some of the headlines here are, again, all examples of these activities in California, some of which we have been partnered to that are exciting developments and kind of ongoing efforts in your state. So I'd like to just in the final minute or two of my presentation here, if we can go to the next slide, talk through what one of these opportunities looks like from an economic perspective and give you some numbers about why this kind of solution, this kind of thinking about grid resilience that is really customer focused and starts as close to the customer as possible can make sense not only from a resilience perspective, but also from an economic perspective. So the context here, and this chart is available in the paper that we released last year. The context is, of course, the public safety power shutoffs that PG&E and other California utilities have been forced to impose on California customers to minimize or avoid the risk of wildfires caused by transmission and distribution lines. In 2019, those shutoffs affected more than 1 million customers, and economic losses were estimated at least $2 billion from those events. We wanted to understand how distributed solar plus storage systems could be used to not only keep the lights on for critical loads within customer homes and businesses, but also how those assets could also provide economic value and carbon reduction to California more broadly every other day of the year. And long story short, the chart shows the findings where on the left, it's a big cost to take 1 million customers, $34 billion net present cost to take 1 million customers and put solar plus storage on their rooftops. But when you stack all the benefits, you get energy from those PV systems every day of the year that the sun shines, which is most days. You get capacity, you can avoid imports, you can avoid gas plants. You get carbon reduction benefits at some assumed cost of carbon emissions. And then you also have this last category of savings of black sky value, or the ability to keep the lights on during an outage. So again, when you think of all of the ways in which these systems provide value, they can start to pencil in a way that something like a gas generator might not. So my last slide then is just putting some of those principles that I talked through into this California context. So this kind of solution does address this risk of linear dependence. It breaks that chain. It puts the resources that people need closer to them. If we can click through the other 3 principles here, this kind of solution does leverage the market. People are already buying PV plus solar or PV plus storage systems in California, and that's being pushed for a variety of reasons. Deploying them resiliently doesn't take that much extra money. This approach can prioritize critical loads in a way that kind of managing transmission shutoffs at the bulk power level cannot. And it can also maximize the economic value. Again, I talked through the ways in which this kind of solution actually pays back every day of the year and not just on the really bad days. So that's kind of the way that we think about the problem on our team, the way we've applied some of that thinking in California. If we can go to the next slide, I'd like to just make a point that we do work globally. Our US-based team and our global team support steel in the ground and partnerships across the world in a lot of geographies. And the work that we do everywhere comes back to each location in which we work, so that we are always aware of kind of the cutting edge and what's possible when it comes to resilient and decarbonized grids. So to speak to one of those steel on the ground examples, I'd like to invite my colleague, David Gumbs, to walk through an example from Anguilla. David, before joining RMI as a principal in our Islands Energy program, was the CEO of the utility in Anguilla and led the company through its response to Hurricane Irma. David, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you this afternoon to share some information about my experience in the Caribbean working with RMI. In my role at RMI, we design and implement resilient renewable energy systems in the Caribbean islands. And as Mark explained, I was the CEO of Anguilla Electricity Company. Now, I had the unfortunate experience of going through Hurricane Irma in 2017, which devastated the island of Anguilla. It took us 100 days, almost exactly, to recover the grid to 100%. Now, that was an incredible effort, and we're applauded greatly for the accomplishment. But can you imagine 100 days without electricity? And I was one of those persons who got electricity back on the 92nd day, while every day working 12-hour days to bring back the grid. Now, we're going to pivot a little bit, and I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done in the Bahamas. In 2019, the Bahamas was devastated by Hurricane Dorian. The island of Abaco, you would have seen it all over the news. It was devastated the same and in much larger respects to Anguilla. There was a much larger loss of life in Abaco, and the grid was impacted in many different ways, different to the experience in Anguilla. Now, if I were to sort of bring this home a little bit, the Caribbean is facing every year more and more more devastating events, and these are Category 5 hurricanes. In the last year, we had record-breaking events where we had roughly 5 category or named storms in the Caribbean basin all simultaneously. In 2017, we had 4 Category 5 hurricanes hitting the region. They devastated over 15 different islands. So can you imagine the impact that this has on the livelihood of the people of the Caribbean? Now, to connect this to the story that we're telling about California, the island is designed just like the California grid is designed. You have a centralized grid that is distributing electricity 100 miles, 200 miles in any direction in an island context. What we've done in Abaco, coming out of the devastation of Hurricane Dorian, we've redesigned the grid for the island of Abaco. We created 3 zones, and in those zones, the most populated center, the center zone at the center of Abaco, we created microgrids that are solar and storage that will recover the grid or continue to power critical facilities during disasters. That could be a storm, that could be a heat event, that could be any event that brings or accident of any sort that takes down the grid. Now, each of these 3 zones can be powered independently of the central power plant, which is located in the center of the island. So what happens? We get to recover the grid much faster, and the grid is much more resilient because if a storm passes in the south and knocks out the grid in the south, the north and the center of the island will continue to be powered, while the south is continued to be rebuilt. But during this whole event, we'll have critical facilities, hospitals, water treatment plants, and other shelters, all powered by these resilient renewable energy grids. Next slide, please. California versus the Caribbean experience. Yes, it's different in scale, but besides scale, there isn't a whole lot of difference between the two. And just to compare natural disasters, whether it's a drought, a fire, or a hurricane, it's the same event that will take down the grid, and you have to rebuild, replan, and redesign. Next slide, please. Mark talked a little bit about this before, but there are incredible benefits that come with a renewable energy smart grid, microgrid system. You have the ability to recover quickly, which I've talked about a little bit. You have the ability to island these systems where they can supply power to a local community or individual site. Mark talked about that a little bit. And you have the ability to reduce the duration and frequency of outages for any particular community or location. So we're not going to get into all of the points that are reflected here because there's so many advantages, but just by its sheer presence, it reduces the cost and improves the efficiency of the operations of the grid. You can do peak shaving, which reduces the overall power that's needed at any given time on the grid. You can reduce spin and reserve, which reduces fuel and other costs that the grid would, or that the electrical system would otherwise incur. And of course, it reduces the maintenance and improves the fuel efficiency of the overall system. But at the end of the day, this is something that improves lives. It saves lives and it improves lives. It improves the health of many people, or those people in those communities. And Rushad would have pointed that out earlier in the presentation. And then finally, I'd just like to say, these are renewable energy systems that abate carbon production, which means we have a big impact on the environment and improving the environment and health for all of us. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Exciting kind of parallels between some of the experiences that help strengthen RMI's work globally. I'll pass it to Jules to help facilitate a Q&A discussion.
Thank you, Mark. And thank you, David. We've had a number of questions pop in, and because we're running a little bit of time, I'm going to dive straight in. First of all, Kim Worsenscroft had a very good point. I talk about a decisive decade, but the clock is ticking. And Kim, just to help you understand how we're focused on this, I every month have a calculator on my desktop that shows how many days we've got left before the decisive decade is over. So rest assured that we have our nose on that issue. Let me ask first a complicated question, and I'm going to ask our Stephanie Green, our managing director for our buildings practice, who earlier worked at PG&E. Stephanie, this idea of islanding and breaking up the grid into smaller pieces is a complicated thing to do, but you can do it on a small island when you control the whole thing. How would you think about doing that in California?
Yeah, well, thanks, Jules. And my apologies that my internet went out due to a storm right as we were jumping into Q. Yeah, Jules, I mean, I think that the short answer is it's possible. I think with such a large grid, you know, so much of the power is controlled and flows centrally through the CAISO, and proposition to fully island the grids and larger tranches of the system that are separated is more viable than assuming for like massive islanding across California is the short answer. And I think, you know, PG&E has done an enormous amount of work to make the grid more resilient with the PSPS events, and to try to find ways and alternatives for customers to go to backup centers and to provide for like health critical customers and otherwise.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yes, this is not an easy challenge in a market like California. David, another question that came in was, how do you make the implementation of these renewables projects attractive to the local community? You've had experience doing this in the service territory of your utility. How do you co-opt the local community, the local population?
That's actually that's probably the easiest part of our role, in that is getting community support and involvement. Communities actually understand this, they want this to happen. I think what happens is, it seems, just like we were talking about, California is huge, it seems impossible. How do we get it done? When we went to Abaco is huge, it seemed impossible. How do we redesign the system to make it happen? And you start at square one. And literally, if all of us take the steps and measures to do a little bit, it results in a lot.
Thank you. The other thing that I have seen in my home country of the Netherlands is that if you give local communities the opportunity to invest in the renewables project, often a very significant sense of ownership emerges that makes the permitting and the siting simpler, more easy. I saw someone ask a question about battery storage. How do we manage the benefits of the environment of battery storage while at the same time managing the toll of battery manufacturing on the environment? And that's a very relevant question. We have published a report on battery technology of the future about 18 months ago. And one of the exciting things is that we see new battery technologies emerging, particularly for long duration storage, that are based on very environmentally friendly chemistries, on chemistries that are not at all polluting in the same way that your smaller and your traditional batteries in your household are polluting. The other thing that is underway is efforts to start the recycling of batteries. J.D. Straubel, one of the founders of Tesla, has built a business now that looks to recycle lots of the lithium-ion batteries that will be the backbone of our EV fleet and so on. So things are moving in the right direction there. I have a question for either Mark or for, yeah, I think Mark, maybe you are the right one. Nuclear did not come up in your conversation, and people wonder, why do RMI folks never talk enthusiastically about the low carbon possibilities of nuclear technology?
Thanks, Jules. It's a great question. there's not a short and simple answer, but at least a partial answer that I'll offer you in this conversation is that, as Jules explained in his intro and as I focus on every day with my team, we are focused on the 2030 imperative to reduce emissions by 50% in this decade. That means that a power system that is on the order of 80% served by carbon-free resources. I have not seen credible stories or studies that show that a technology like next generation nuclear could scale up safely and cost effectively within that 8.5 years left that we have in this decisive decade. It may in fact turn out to be an important piece of the solution for the last 10 to 20% of decarbonizing the power system. There are many other contenders that could play that role. Nuclear is one. But for the next 8.5 years, for this decade, for 80% carbon-free power, we have a much more cost-effective and easily scalable set of tools that we focus on.
Lauren, early on in the conversation, someone asked that he is worried that so much of the decarbonization is dependent on incentives, not on mandates and regulations. But I think that we're actually seeing in many parts of our work, mandates and regulations emerging. Can you talk a little bit about the balance between incentives and mandates?
Yeah, absolutely, Jules. We look at both sides of that puzzle within our work. Our work has historically been focused a lot on the market catalysts you laid out in the opening presentation here. So thinking about what is the comprehensive set of things we can do to unlock both the market and market activity. How can we get people to adopt these technologies quicker by providing incentives for them to do so that both buy down the cost of deploying and also increase the cost of not deploying these types of systems. But we are increasingly seeing mandates and policy-driven solutions as great tools in our toolkit that we need to deploy, especially with the urgency that we're seeing.
Thank you. Yes, it is important to think about all the tools that we have in our arsenal, or all the arrows in our quiver, because this is such an urgent issue now that we can't bet on one solution. We have to deploy multiple solutions alongside each other. Along those lines, a question just popped up from Simone about the role of carbon pricing. We haven't talked about that in this series. Rushad, I'm going to put you on the spot here because this is not necessarily your area of expertise, but what's your view on carbon pricing? And why is that no longer such a big part of the discussion here in the US?
Yeah, this is going to be I'm going to caveat this by saying that we're not experts on politics, and by no means am I. But I think one of the fundamental reasons is that policymakers, at least in federal and increasingly in state governments, have largely given up on the issue. I don't think you have a strong enough coalition kind of championing it. And it's been complicated, I think, with at the subnational level, and I'm thinking here of the instances in Washington of an actual proposed carbon tax, California's cap and trade, where there's been pretty active opposition from the environmental justice community, and that's obviously particularly difficult to overcome. Some of those concerns are valid and well placed, and just referring again to the California specific example, cap and trade in California. The concern was there's a philosophical concern around the polluter pays principle. Why should anybody be left off the hook just because they can afford to pay more for the right to pollute? Because if you are living in a community that is subject to that pollution, you're not really helped by it. So that's the validity around the concern. What the data showed, though, with California's cap and trade, which is you could think of as a proxy carbon tax, is that in aggregate, pollution levels of ambient pollutants actually dropped in the most vulnerable, lowest income communities. So the outcome was a net positive for the state and for many communities in the state. It did not, however, mitigate both the more philosophical objections and the hyperlocal objections of many from frontline community-based organizations and environmental justice groups. So I'd say it's a combination of those two things that seem to have kind of moved it off the table. The lack of it being championed by any political party, and a lot of active and effective opposition from the environmental justice community.
Thank you, Rushad. And that is, of course, very different from what we see in other parts of the world, where a price on carbon is actually emerging, including in China. Folks, we could continue this discussion for quite a long time. RMI folk are very passionate about this subject, but we don't have that many more minutes. I want to take one moment to thank my fellow panelists, but also very much thank our incredibly wonderful hosts who have helped put on this series, and all of you who have your hand in our back. What we do is only possible because of the generosity of the donors that support RMI for our work. So if you feel so inclined, feel free to visit us on www.rmi.org/donate. Thank you all for being part of this. And John, you have been very much an inspiration behind this series. May I hand it back to you for final comments, John Gartman?
Sure. Thanks, Jules. I want to say just two things. First is a big thank you. Not only, starting with RMI, Jules, Rushad, today, Mark, David, Lauren, and Stephanie. Also, it's been great to work with you. I want to thank Ezekiel, who's in the background. You can't see him and he hasn't spoken, but he's undertaken a ton of effort to put together and synthesize and aggregate speakers for this 3-part series. And we are grateful to all of you, not just for the comments and for the substance that you've given us, and for your optimism, which I will return to in just a moment, but also for the work that you do every day when you get off these webinars and you go back and you do your real job, because RMI is, in my mind, making the biggest difference of all in the world in the energy sector, and you've been doing it for 40 years, and we're really lucky and grateful to have you. I would also like to thank the many government officials that have attended these 3 webinars. We've had people at the federal level, the state level, the county level, the city level, lots of folks here. I'm very grateful to all of you for showing up, because you have to lead us through this. So thanks again. And then the rest of you that have attended as we've gone through this, I know you're out there. I know you're using the information. I know you're taking the data and championing it, which, as we all know, and now I will stand corrected and say we have 8.5 years of our decisive decade left. And so I'll close with a comment about hope. And Curtis made an interesting point, Curtis Chang, the sponsor for today, and I totally agree with that. 200 years ago, Alexander von Humboldt understood and told the world that humans were changing climate, and we didn't hear it. And 34 years ago in Congress, James Hansen from NASA stood up and said, it's here, it's now, the greenhouse effect, this is a quote, has been detected and it's changing our climate now, and we didn't hear it. And I think one of the unfortunate benefits of living through the catastrophes of today is that we're starting to hear it. It's unfortunate that the human species has to get its back up against the wall to act, but that is where we are. And some days that makes me sad, but this brings me back to Curtis's point, which is every time I see the work done by RMI, and I see the optimism and the creativity and actually the results, it changes me from that dire, hopeless state to thinking that we do have a chance at fixing this problem. We do have a chance if we all remain working together, energized for the immediate target of the next 8.5 years. So thank you not only to RMI, but to all of the rest of you who attended this series. And we look forward to seeing you hopefully again in the future.
Thank you, John.